Hey everyone, this is chapter 8 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Chapter 8 is titled Émigré. In May 1934, in a letter to Pollock, Max Horkheimer enthusiastically related her impressions of New York. Quote, "New York is a huge city," end quote, she wrote. Quote, "Without seeing it, one has no idea. It is simply incredible, unreal. Paris, London, all of Europe is a Negro village. One is constantly confounded by the people, by daily life, by the atmosphere, the food, the housing, etc. At 1 o'clock in the morning, you can buy whatever the heart desires. All the shops are open, plus the streets and houses gleam in their light," end quote. Her account no doubt aroused Pollock's curiosity, given his long-standing fascination with all things modern and urban, but Pollock was also concerned that the interior, the realm of his utopian friendship covenant with Horkheimer, might not withstand this new world. Once he arrived in the United States, he was so busy that he had little time to reflect on his new circumstances in any great detail. Occasionally here, Horkheimer would remark on the future of their relationship, but only in 1935 was he able to undertake a comprehensive revision of their friendship contract, first drafted in 1911. His memorandum bore the title Materialien für die Neuformulierung von Grundsätzen, material for the reformulation of basic principles. The significance of this document is indicated not least by the fact that it is actually more detailed than the original contract. In it, Pollock fastidiously laid out rules for their new lines designed to ensure that the ideals that had governed their covenant from the outset were not sidelined by the challenges their new circumstances posed. The 6-page memorandum comprised 13 articles in total and laid out the standards that should henceforth govern their shared life. The first article placed the, quote, "continual conduct of relations," end quote, center stage, acknowledging that this required, quote, "constant concentration and a great deal time," end quote. To this end, it is critical that both parties were at all times, even under the most difficult circumstances, intimately familiar with each other's thoughts and activities. Quote, "lengthy separations," end quote, "should be avoided if at all possible, even if doing so entailed the disadvantages for one or both parties." The second article reiterated the long-standing principle that, quote, "the interior always takes precedence over the exterior," and quote, quote, "the interior always takes precedence over the exterior," end quote, stressing that this was no, quote, "abstract truth for Sundays and the holidays," end quote, but the guiding principle they were determined genuinely to implement in their daily lives. The third article offered a truly succinct definition of the interior. Quote, 1. Our covenant. 2. Our values. 3. Our attitude towards the world. Conviviality, valor, pride, end quote. The fourth article treated the need to arrive at shared judgments in all essential matters and identify with them unconditionally. It was complemented by the fifth article, which stressed the need for each party to identify unreservedly with the other and genuinely take the other seriously in all respects. It was noted, however, that, quote, F's idiosyncrasy of feeling gratification only if is seen as a gift giver, parenthesis, rather than acting for the sake of the cause, end quote, formed an obstacle in this respect. The sixth article treated mutual assurances required to proceed under the extraordinarily precarious and hazardous circumstances they now confronted. One needed to be certain, it stipulated, quote, that one is never lonely or isolated, that one can rely on the other unconditionally, not only when it comes to big concerns, but also in matters of everyday life, that the other will respond to more significant issues in the same way as one would oneself. This way of life is one of the central goods that our covenant should engender," end quote. To achieve this, the stipulations laid out in the Articles 4 and 5 needed to be implemented on a daily basis. Decisions needed to be taken by consensus and acknowledged as definitive. No action could be taken until agreement was reached on the matter in question. An additional clause introduced 2 safe words for instances in which it was impossible to discuss a controversial issue until it was resolved. Quote, "plain pouvoir," end quote, meant that the other could proceed, unresolved objections notwithstanding. Quote, "veto," end quote, meant just that. The seventh article revisited the commitment to pride that was integral to their attitude towards the world. Its importance lay in the fact that it counteracted the, quote, bourgeois organization of urges, end quote, required in the process of a socialization designed to make individuals refrain from doing what they really wanted to do. Closely related, the eighth article stressed the importance of psychological self-knowledge and regular mutual psychological scrutiny to uncover the respective others' neurotic response patterns. These response patterns reflected the incorrect organization of the world and were therefore pitted against the, quote, correct attitude towards society, end quote, outlined in the ninth article. The account of the current state of society read like a blend of Marx and the cultural critics whose texts they had read as young adults. Quote, in today's society, all human relations are adulterated. Ultimately, none of the kindness, approbation, benevolence is meant seriously. Only competition within the class and the struggle between the classes is genuine, end quote. Yet their characterization of the class struggle differed markedly from Marxism, was clearly predicated on their own experience of persecution. Quote, every instance of approbation, of success, of apparently sympathetic interest is owed to jailers who let those who own neither success nor power go to rack and ruin with utter indifference or torment them without restraint. All acts of kindness are directed not at the individual person, but at his position in society. This becomes brutally obvious when the person in question, due to some significant or not so significant change, parenthesis, stock exchange, anti-Jewish incitement, end parenthesis, has lost its position. It is not the abstract insight, however, that matters. Rather, you must always bear in mind that it is you yourself who is at their mercy once all the kind and well-meaning people in your daily life became aware of the fact that you have become powerless, end quote. Perhaps Pollock and Horkheimer addressed each other with the, quote, you, end quote, to whom the text appealed. More likely they were using it in the sense of, quote, one, end quote. The implication could not be more obvious. Quote, never on a plane with the jailers, solidarity with the victims, end quote, was the motto. It was important to appreciate that even as things stood, people existed who alongside their function were also human individuals, quote, especially among women, end quote. The final article reiterated the commitment to, quote, live in accordance with our insights and realize the values we acknowledge to the best of our ability, end quote. It is no exaggeration to suggest that Pollock and Horkheimer's friendship covenant was ultimately totalitarian in aspiration. By way of a social experiment, they sought to transcend the territoriality and limitations of the ego by radically exposing themselves to each other and revisiting their own assumptions in the reflection of the other, a process that obviously presupposed unconditional mutual solidarity. They yearned for a good life, anticipating the revolution that was nowhere to be seen, based on sensible social forms that transcended bourgeois morality and the competitiveness dictated by the capitalist order. Theirs was an experiment, then, that is radically odds with all too popular. Theirs was an experiment that is at radical odds with the all too popular cliche of critical theory's unmitigated negativity and its unrelenting refusal to countenance utopian visions of a better life. Whether the covenant was really a model for society or as a whole may have been a moot point, but against Adorno's endlessly cited contention that, quote, wrong life cannot be lived in the right way, end quote, Pollock and Horkheimer maintained throughout their adult life that some ways of leading one's life were most certainly infinitely better than others. Faced with radically new circumstances, a foreign language, unfamiliar social conventions, and social relations that struck them as being largely superficial, their covenant served, even more than before, as a bulwark against the hazards and vagaries of the outside world. Quote, New York, with its magnificent abundance of buildings, seems to symbolize the strength that resides in this country, in this society, end quote. Horkheimer wrote to his former teacher, Hans Cornelius, in June 1934, describing his first impressions of his new surroundings. The potential impact of this strength was enormous, but it was unclear where it might be directed. Then again, in marked contrast to their European peers, Americans seem still to trust in the ideals of the Enlightenment. Quote, people also seem to be younger here than in Europe, For the most part, they lacked the skepticism and fundamental distrust that confronts every new thought over there. While faith in the possibility of progress that might improve the circumstances in which individuals live has almost disappeared over there, here your average man or woman on the street aspires to an ever more sensible organization of all relations and believes that this aspiration can be realized." End quote. Yet all the positive impressions of the first couple of months notwithstanding, they felt distinctly out of place in the United States, not least because, given everything that had happened, they no longer shared the faith of most Americans in progress. They perceived the USA as a country that seemed super modern, yet had in fact fallen out of time given its fixation on ideas that had long since become anachronistic. Pollock and Horkheimer found this orientation charming and dangerous roughly in equal measure, given that this naive faith might well be frustrated at any point and then engender barbarism. Of course, a stereotypical German quest for genuine depth may also have contributed to their fundamental distrust of potentially encouraging appearances. Not that the land of limitless possibilities exactly went out of its way to welcome our leftist Jewish refugees. Far from it. The FBI had a keen eye on the members of the Institute in general and its directors in particular, and collected hundreds of documents, reports, and intercepted telegrams. The Bureau was particularly wary of enemy aliens and surveilled numerous European intellectuals, Pollock among them. Cryptographers examined letters and telegrams on the assumption that they contained some kind of code, and the individuals involved with Pollock were questioned. Eventually, on the 18th of July, 1941, J. Edgar Hoover personally ordered the termination of the surveillance. Quote, "The telegram forwarded your office contains several words that could possibly be, quote, code." He wrote, quote, "However, it is suggested that these words, in most instances at least, are the names of other German Jewish refugees, ... It is believed that the telegram in its entirety referred to legitimate transactions of the above institute or projects in which the institute is interested, and accordingly it is not desired that any additional investigation be conducted." End quote. Even so, until quote Horkheimer, end quote, aka quote all right, end quote, as the agents called him, parenthesis, because Horkheimer frequently closed his letters to Pollock with the affirmative, quote, all right, and his, quote, accomplice, Pollock, returned to Europe, they never dropped off the FBI's radar entirely. To what extent Pollock and Horkheimer were aware of this attention is a moot point. Rumors about the surveillance certainly circulated among German emigres. Like other members of the Institute's inner circle, Pollock has been accused of living in style while cutting other people's salaries and stipends. There is certainly no denying that Pollock and Horkheimer in particular always lived in relative comfort, and no one would suggest that they ever encountered any genuine material hardship. That is in no small measure due to the fact that Pollock, who was responsible both for the Institute's resources and for Horkheimer's private assets, consistently prioritized the commitments of their covenant. To this end, not only the personal and intellectual, but also the material preconditions for the preservation of the interior came before all else. Alongside the Horkheimers and Pollock, the interior now also included Pollock's great love, Andrei. It is presumably the Nazis coming to power in 1933 and the, quote, Aryanization, end quote, of Marx's business the following year that led the couple to reconsider their options, and they divorced amicably. Now a free agent, quote, D, was determined to resume her relationship with Pollock and met with him in Geneva in late April 1934. They went on was only in part a business trip that lasted several weeks, until Horkheimer gently reminded him of his duties, including stays in Rome and Paris. Back in Geneva, D moved in with Pollock, and Pollock began to arrange their move to the United States. In 1934, Pollock took the Empress of Britain from Cherbourg via Southampton to Quebec, where he met Horkheimer. From there, they traveled by train to New York. By the end of the year, Pollock had already secured a permanent residency permit, and D was able to join him in October 1935. Their old love had matured into an extraordinarily close bond, and as it became increasingly clear that neither of them would be returning to Europe anytime soon, they decided, after careful consideration, to marry in order to regularize their residency status. For Pollock, marriage was an obsolete institution, and he certainly never saw himself marrying. There's a footnote that I missed. Never mind. For all the passion he invested in codifying his friendship with Horkheimer, he had consistently and vehemently rejected any suggestion that he might marry. Perhaps this is one last act of rebellion against his birth family. Now in exile and faced with innumerable inescapable constraints, this form of anti-bourgeois rejectionism imploded. On the 8th of November 1935, André Vogue, formerly Marx, and Friedrich Pollock were married by the city clerk of Manhattan. She was 37, he was 41. Writing to Wittfogel in China a week later, Pollock had the following to say about the ceremony, quote, "I could tell you quite a few amusing tales about the prosaic nature of weddings here, ... quote, lift your hands, ... you're married now, $2, ... $2 please, end quote. And with that the edifying ceremony was over, end quote." It had been a long while since Pollock had anyone close whom he genuinely trusted in his life, other than Marx and Madame Horkheimer. This may have weighed all the more heavily, given that he had virtually lost touch with his birth family. Following his mother's death in 1930, he rarely spoke to his increasingly morose father, whom he repeatedly urged to leave Germany. He insisted on staying in Stuttgart, however, where he died in 1937 at the age of 71. Father and son met one last time in Switzerland in 1936, but we have no information as to what transpired between them on this occasion. A letter of condolence Pollock wrote to Leo Löwenthal in June 1942 may offer us a glimpse of his own feelings when his father died. Quote, "I know," end quote, he wrote, quote, "that for all our detachment from our parents, the death of a father can be deeply affecting. It is therefore no mere formality when I offer you and your wife my condolences," end quote. Little did Pollock know in 1937 what horrors would have awaited his parents had they still been alive at the beginning of the war. What of Pollock's other relatives and close acquaintances? As we saw, Pollock's brother Hans had taken over their father's suitcase factory. Forced to leave Freiburg University once the Nazis came to power, Hans and Ida's daughter, Lieselata, continued her studies, supported financially by her uncle, Friedrich Pollock, at the Sorbonne, where she graduated in 1937. In 1935, Hans and Ida's daughter settled in Amsterdam, presumably following her marriage to the German Jewish banker Paul Zomer, born 1911, returning to Paris only during term time. The family business was, quote, Aryanized, end quote, in 1935, leaving Hans and Ida Pollock without a livelihood. In January 1936, Hans and Ida Pollock, along with Ida's 70-year-old mother, Babette, quote, Zetchen, and, quote, Joseph, made their way to Amsterdam, where Max Horkheimer's psychoanalyst, Kurt Landauer, too, had found refuge and was able to help them find accommodation. Given the extortionate levy raised for those who sought to leave the country, the funds they were able to take with them were minimal, and the Pollocks were dependent on support from charitable organizations and acquaintances, notably a Christian solicitor called Halama, who helped them with money time and again. Following the German invasion in May 1940, the situation of the Jewish refugees rapidly deteriorated. Civil resistance on the part of the Dutch population notwithstanding, the Germans' anti-Jewish policies were rigorously implemented. Following the systematic expropriation of the Jewish population and a succession of other repressive measures, deportations, primarily from the Westerbroek transit camp, began on the 15th of July 1942. Because the transports ran so smoothly and no attempt was ever made to sabotage them, deportations from the Netherlands were given precedence over other transports, so much so that from March to July 1943, the trains had to be diverted to the Sobibor death camps because Auschwitz was unable to dispose of parenthesis, i.e. murder, end parenthesis, the deportees quickly enough. By October 1943, all the Jews who had not gone into hiding had been rounded up and placed in camps. There was a short lull in deportations in the winter of 1943/44, while Westerbork was in quarantine. But the transports to Auschwitz, Theresienstadt, and Bergen-Belsen then continued until November 1944. Roughly half of the 20,000 Jews who had gone into hiding were eventually caught, mostly because they were betrayed. Of the 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands at the time of the German invasion, 107,000 were deported. Only 5,000 of them returned. No other West European country, indeed, few other European countries were as badly affected by the Shoah. As we saw, Andries Sternheim and his family were among those murdered. So too was Karl Landauer, initially exempt from deportation because he worked as a counselor for the Jewish Council. He was taken to Westerbork on the 20th of June 1943. From there, on the 15th of February 1944, together with his wife, Lena Landauer, née Kahn, and their daughter, Eva Landauer, he was deported to Bergen-Belsen. His death was recorded on the 27th of January 1945, parenthesis, the day on which Auschwitz was liberated. Lena Landauer was liberated in Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April 1945. Eva Landauer, who had left the camp with the last transport headed for Theresienstadt, was liberated in Trubitz, parenthesis, near Frankfurt/Oder, in parenthesis, on the 23rd of April 1945. After the war, they moved to New York, where they joined Ava's siblings, Susa Landauer, which had survived in hiding, and Paul Landauer, who had fled to the Yeshuv. Miraculously, thanks to an exit visa Friedrich Pollock somehow managed to secure for them, the Pollocks were able to leave the Netherlands for Buenos Aires on the 11th of August 1941. 2 days prior to their departures, they were once again summoned by the Currency Control Bureau for questioning. There, Hans Pollock later recalled, quote, "The official literally said to me, 'I see that the issue with your assets in Stuttgart has been resolved. We have your share certificates and the rest is already ours. But where are your silver caddy and your life insurance?'" End quote. There was no silver caddy and no life insurance. At this point, everything had been taken from them, but they got out. Alas, they were unable to take Ida Pollock's now 75-year-old mother, Zechten Joseph, with them, or Zechten Joseph with them. Halama continued to take care of her, but on the 18th of September 1942, she was deported from Westerbork to Auschwitz, where she was murdered on arrival. In most cases, it was impossible to ascertain what had happened to friends and relatives until after the war. Early in 1950, Hans, now Juan, Pollock, enthusiastically informed his brother that he had discovered some of their relatives in Montevideo. Quote, "You must remember Dr. Fritz and Paul Jacobi and Elsa. She married one Dr. Windmüller. Paul, who studied in Freiburg and ate with the parents almost every day, it aroused many memories in me of the Schlossberg Castlemount the Sternwald Forest, Günterstall, etc. Paul saw your name in Aufbau, wrote to the editorial office whether you are the FP from Freiburg, Stuttgart, asking to be put in touch. They lost everything, live in modest circumstances, and are hoping for reparations." End quote. Quote, "Have you been in touch with Wolf Frank?" End quote. He went on, quote, "or with Walter and Heinz? And what about other Pollock relatives?" End quote. The well-known and well-connected leftist publicist and pioneering broadcaster Wolf Frank was a maternal cousin. Walter and Heinz Pollock were the sons of their father's younger brother, the aforementioned Hans Ludwig Pollock. One way or another, they all ended up in the United States. Wolf Frank, his wife, Marga Frank, née Oppenheimer, and their son, Michael, fled to Paris in 1933, where Frank published a still interesting Führer durch die deutsche Emigration, parenthesis, Guide to the German Emigrant Community, and parenthesis. Initially interned following the German invasion in 1940, Frank was able to flee to North Africa. From there, the family set sail via Martinique to New York, where they arrived on the Saint-Domingue on the 10th of January 1941. Once they arrived in the United States, Frank worked as a radio engineer in the armaments industry. After the war, he retained as a musicologist and librarian. He retrained as a musicologist and librarian. Walter and Heinz Pollock left much later. Perhaps they thought they might be spared, given that their parents were no longer members of the Jewish community and they themselves had been baptized. It was following the birth of their first son, Walter, in 1904, that Hans Ludwig, parenthesis, formerly Isidore Louis, and parenthesis, Pollock, formally declared that he, his wife Alice Pollock, née Goldschmidt, originally came from Strasbourg, and by implication, their newborn son, were revoking their membership of the congregation. In 1913, there seems to have been some sort of confusion regarding Walter's status, and his father again revoked his membership of the Jewish congregation. Eventually, on the 3rd of December 1916, he had both of his sons baptized. In the case of the younger son, Heinz, this story took a rather unexpected turn when, in 1931, he attended the municipal authorities to make a rather remarkable statement. Quote, "The student Heinz Pollock, who lives in Freiburg, 1. Ihr Günther Stahlstrasse, number 32, appeared and made the following declaration: I revoke my membership of the official Protestant Church and wish to join the Israelite religious community." End quote. Attached to the record is a statement from the district rabbinate confirming that he had, quote, rejoined, end quote, but also noting that a, quote, specific ritual, end quote, still needed to be performed to render the decision religiously valid. Heinz Pollock does not seem to have been married at the time, so the need or desire to accommodate his status to the wishes of a woman he was set to wed or her family presumably cannot be the explanation. Perhaps he, like other German Jews, wanted to make a clear stance in the face of the ever more prominent role anti-Semitism played in German political life. Of course, none of this was of any interest to the Nazis, for whom the Pollocks, a family comprising two members with no religious affiliation, one Protestant and one member of the Jewish congregation, were all equally Jewish simply by descent. As a physician and, following in his father's footsteps, officer of Freiburg's Carnival Association, Hans Ludwig Pollock had been a highly respected citizen. Yet neither his professional and social status nor the fact that he had turned his back on Judaism protected him in a state fundamentally predicated on rabid anti-Semitism. Nor, it has to be said, did he really have any reason to believe otherwise, given that stormtroopers promptly stood outside his practice during the nationwide boycott of Jewish enterprises on the 1st of April 1933. His license to treat patients on the health service was revoked, and in 1935 he had to close his practice. He was forced to sell the property he had inherited on Günther Stahlstrasse, now Adolf Hitler Strasse. Eventually, all his remaining assets were confiscated and he was allowed to draw down no more than 300 Reichsmarks a month. Hans Ludwig Pollock was one of the more than 30,000 Jews arrested during the November pogrom of 1938 and taken to concentration camps, in his case to Dachau, where he contracted tuberculosis. His wife, Alice Pollock, née Goldschmidt, and their two sons were able to flee to the United States, where they became Alice Walter and Henry W. Pons, parenthesis, a notable research chemist, end parenthesis. Hans Ludwig Pollock was released in December 1939, but never recovered from the camp experience. Sick, lonely, and isolated, he died just 3 months later, on the 10th of March 1939. Friedrich Pollock's aunt, Rosa, parenthesis, Rosalia, end parenthesis, Nördlinger, née Pollock, and her husband, Zygmunt Nördlinger, parenthesis, Julius Pollock's former partner, end parenthesis, were deported on the 15th of June 1942 from Cologne to Theresienstadt, where Rosa Nördlinger perished on the 1st of September 1942. Less than 3 weeks later, Zygmunt Nördlinger was sent on to the Treblinka death camp. Of the 2,003 Jews on this transport, only one survived. Friedrich Pollock's doctoral supervisor, Siegfried Budge, fell into destitution following the revocation of his academic teaching license, and his health soon faltered. Following his death in 1941, his widow, Ella Budge, née Mayer, was deported in July 1942 to Theresienstadt, where she perished on the 6th of November 1943. One can continue this list of relatives, friends, and associates for a while yet, but this may suffice to indicate the extent to which members of the Institute were personally affected by the Nazis' annihilation of European Jewry. Writing to his brother Hans, parenthesis, now Juan, end parenthesis, in 1945, Friedrich Pollock suggested that his, quote, personal life has been undeservedly happy and successful, and one takes into account what is going on in the world, end quote. In an important sense, this was true, of course, yet it is hard to avoid the impression that survivor guilt also led him to underestimate the extent to which he himself was affected by the catastrophic events in Europe. This sense of guilt was perhaps best expressed by Hannah Arendt in her essay titled We Refugees, published in the Menorah Journal in 1943. It reflects exactly what occasional remarks in his correspondence suggest Pollock felt too. Quote, we did our best, end quote, Arendt wrote, quote, to prove to other people that we were just ordinary immigrants. We declared that we had departed of our own free will to countries of our choice, and we denied that our situation had anything to do with, quote, so-called Jewish problems, end quote. Yes, we were, quote, immigrants, or, quote, newcomers, who had left our country because, one fine day, it no longer suited us to stay, or for purely economic reasons. We wanted to rebuild our lives. That was all, end quote. Arendt. Pollock knew full well, of course, that his move to the United States had not been in the least bit voluntary. But Pollock never described himself as a refugee or owned up, at least vis-a-vis the exterior, to what Arendt described as the Jewish emigre experience. Quote, we lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life, ... We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. We left our relatives in Polish ghettos, and our best friends have been killed in concentration camps, and that means the rupture of our private lives. End quote. Pollock was indeed lucky. Pollock's private life, unlike that of so many others, his elective family, Max and Maiden Horkheimer and his wife, survived intact. And he was able to continue working in his profession, yet the sense of having been spared was inextricable from a profound sense of loss. Pollock sought to cope by becoming a dyed-in-the-wool American. Pollock adopted the manners and fashion of his new compatriots, devouring the country's relevant research literature, and used the American English language whenever he could. Rather than Friedrich or Fritz, he now called himself Frederick and Fred, and instead insisted that his German colleagues do so too. Yet the theories and debates that had preoccupied Pollock in Europe no more lost their hold over Pollock than his personal and emotional ties to the old world. In the United States, everyone was an immigrant, and being American meant having a hybrid identity. Given that he considered himself a German American, it was only logical that Pollock join the German American Writers Association, GAWA, established in October 1938. Oscar Maria Graf was its president. More surprising, perhaps, because it suggests that Pollock was rediscovering his Jewishness in his involvement with Aufbau, the most significant German Jewish émigré periodical. It was initially a small monthly published by the German Jewish Club in New York. This changed dramatically once Manfred George, one of the most prominent leftist journalists of the Weimar era who, since fleeing in 1933, had been involved in various émigré periodical projects, took over as editor in 1939 and began to transform Aufbau into a flagship weekly with a print run of up to 30,000 copies. To this end, he formed a high-caliber advisory board with initially 17, later 12 members. This not only bolstered Aufbau's reputation, but also drew in a much broader range of contributors. On the 16th of May 1941, George addressed his readership as follows, quote, "The editors of, quote, Aufbau, end quote, are gratified in finding that its reading public has further grown during the first half of the year. ... This success makes us both happy and proud. At the same time, it increases our responsibility in this epoch of ever new and growing crises and problems. In full awareness of this situation, the editors have asked a select group of personalities who have taken an active interest in, quote, Aufbau, end quote, to grant our paper the benefit of our advice and experience," end quote. The founding members included illustrious intellectuals and writers such as Albert Einstein, Leon Feuchtwanger, Nahum Goldmann, Emil Ludwig, Thomas Mann, and Friedrich Pollock, who continued to serve on the board until the end of the war. It was in Aufbau's classified section that émigrés addressed the paper's global readership, hoping for information on their missing relatives and friends, and it was Aufbau that first informed most of its readers about the unfolding Shoah. In the aforementioned article, We Refugees, Hannah Arendt, who in her fortnightly column for Aufbau also articulated her growing estrangement from Zionism, touched on the ways in which the Shoah affected its European victims, but also those who had been able to flee, and even drove some of them to suicide. What was unfolding in Europe was simply incomprehensible, and their inability to do anything about it was unbearable. As late as 1961, Pollock, in a letter to his brother and sister-in-law, noted that, quote, "the horrors of the Hitler era," end quote, were, quote, "incomprehensible even now," end quote. Little wonder, then, that Pollock had so little to say about the Shoah. Not a single article by Pollock, not even a book review touched on the topic. What scholars following Horkheimer's criticism of Pollock have frequently qualified as writer's block was born of a genuine inability to find words appropriate to the devastation he was forced to witness from afar. Usually a level-headed analyst even of complex constellations that most certainly did not bode well. Of this, he simply could not make sense. Instead, he sought refuge from theory and practice by helping others who were persecuted. André Pollock, too, was badly affected by the news from Europe. Her life became bleaker yet when, just a year after their wedding, she became seriously ill. Adorno tried to cheer her up by giving her piano lessons, but they were of little comfort to her, given the enormity of the adversities she faced. Pollock tirelessly looked after her, stayed at health resorts with her for weeks, and, on end, consulted dozens of physicians. Eventually, an oncologist diagnosed her with lung cancer. This was a profound shock for Pollock, but outwardly he continued to exude optimism. Downplaying her symptoms as far as possible and no longer willing to be taken for the naive female in need of care and instruction, Pollock had rather patronizingly seen in her when they met. Pollock increasingly sought contact with the exterior. Quote, "I am sitting in a glorious garden," end quote, she wrote on a postcard she sent in 1937 from Lake Placid to Wittfogel in China. Quote, "Yet what I wanted to say was that one can barely believe in the horror in the world and these surroundings, ! Yet we are aware of and distressed by them all the same," end quote. Pollock's cancer metastasized and she eventually succumbed to the disease in August 1939. Quote, "I never have," end quote, Horkheimer wrote in a private letter soon after her death, quote, "in any human being I know seen such a fundamental development towards truth, as indeed during these past 2 years. D has meant so much to us during this time, not to Fritz only, but to Mesdames and myself. I can still see her, a week before her end, sitting upright in bed because lying down was too painful to her. She was panting from a hemorrhage in the lungs which she had suffered, and at the same time discussed a difficult practical problem. Her thinking at this occasion was clear and precise, and she did not allow any compromise. Until her last moment, she has not admitted the mere fact of her illness. This came out, however, out of a strong desire for life. This came not, however, out of a strong desire for life, but from a firm resolution to preserve her faculty of spiritual enjoyment, while her faculty of physical enjoyment was decreasing without mercy. Out of this resolution, or still more, out of regard for her friends, she has literally pushed aside her notion that she was stricken with cancer. She might have taught a psychologist that Freud's theory that repression is chiefly a result of weakness when facing conflicts is too narrow. D has repressed her knowledge out of love, end quote. The ordinary beacon of steadiness and restraint, Pollock was utterly distraught at his wife's death, and the very fact that he felt duty-bound to appear equable and restrained at all times only made things worse. It was he who helped others, friends, colleagues, refugees, not the other way around. Finding that he himself needed support left him disoriented. He was unable to spend time by himself and moved in with the Horkheimers, who employed an émigré couple from Vienna to manage the household of their assembled intérieur à trois. Pollock became even more of a workaholic, devoting all the time and energy he had previously channeled to taking care of his wife to the Institute. Quote, "The meaningful work we, unlike most human beings, are allowed to perform affords him a sense of composure and gratification," end quote, Horkheimer wrote to Karl Landauer in December 1939, adding, quote, "I hope that he too will be able to undertake more academic work in future than has been the case," end quote. The sadness, anger, and powerlessness Pollock felt in connection with his wife's illness and death does indeed seem to have unleashed a particular kind of productivity in him. In the year following her death, Pollock produced his two most significant essays. They ran to just 40 pages in total, but offered probing analyses of the New World Order and reshaped the future work of the Institute in decisive ways. In Pollock's analysis, he was unsparing in the scrutiny of his own presumptions, and he readily accepted the risk that his conclusions might be castigated for marking a betrayal of Marxism. The paradigm shift the Institute underwent at the beginning of the Second World War was, in other words, inextricably linked to Pollock's debilitating and tortuous personal crisis following the death of his wife. The end. Thanks for listening.